Russian efforts to invade Ukraine began to focus on overseas areas. Russia carried out risky maneuvers and military exercises in the Baltic Sea for a certain gain in Ukraine and to gain a broader perspective on the invasion operation. The exercises carried out by the flagship of the Russian naval forces, Gorshkov in the Norwegian Sea, were one of the most important examples of this situation. But there was one detail that Russia overlooked in the Baltics. The US Navy was also striving for the security of Ukraine and for the New World Order to be based on more reliable foundations. And even recently, the US Navy forces have taken a historic step in this regard. The USS Gerald R Ford recently arrived in Oslo. The US Navy's newest aircraft carrier is the first US aircraft carrier to visit Norway in over 6 decades. Oslo, the first stop for the operational deployment of the USS Ford, reflects NATO navies' growing interest in North Atlantic and Arctic waters amid rising tensions with Russia. Ford set sail for the first time earlier this month as part of a carrier strike group and left Norfolk, Virginia. The ship was deployed to the U.S. Navy's Euro-Africa operational area and was sent north for joint and combined training exercises, as well as a range of operations to help mitigate the maritime risks associated with increased activities in the north. At the beginning of the week, U.S. and Norwegian officials visited Ford, which operates in the North Sea. The Navy integrated a Norwegian frigate into the attack group, demonstrating the interoperability of the US and Norway and building a collective operational experience at sea during a major NATO exercise in late 2018. The USS Harry S. Truman became the first U.S. aircraft carrier to sail the Arctic in nearly 30 years. Senior officials of the U.S. Navy have since reported that U.S. warships have routinely been in the North Sea. Authorities also referred to a historic deployment to the Barents Sea in 2020 and a short-term deployment to the North Atlantic in 2022. So how was the arrival of the USS Ford to Oslo received by the parties? Both American and Norwegian officials welcomed Ford's visit to Oslo. The Norwegian defense minister described Ford's arrival in Oslo as a clear statement of the security guarantees provided by NATO and the close cooperation and partnership Norway has with the US. Ford's commander, Captain Rick Burgess, described it as an honor, joy, and excitement to visit Oslo and showed his beloved U.S. partner the Navy's newest class of aircraft carrier. While in Oslo, local officials will visit the aircraft carrier and U.S. sailors will tour the city. According to Norwegian officials, thousands of people lined up on the banks of Oslo's fjord and saw Ford coming. This resulted in an overcrowding of people and vehicles. Ford's nuclear reactors also required special precautions. Norway's Radiation Protection and Nuclear Safety Directorate helped plan the visit. Oslo's waters will be tested for radiation before and after the ship enters port. US officials have shared little information about where Ford will go and what it will do during its deployment. Authorities simply stated that the ship's crew looked forward to working in the Arctic Circle, but the ship's port visit in the Norwegian capital came as NATO forces were conducting a major air and missile defense exercise in the North Atlantic called Formidable Shield. Russia's powerful northern fleet, which operates submarines based on the Kola Peninsula near the Norwegian border and is a growing concern for NATO. Armies will also hold exercises in the region this week. The Russian Navy has notified ships and aircraft in the area to avoid it in the Barents Sea for a week. While the USS Ford's visit to Oslo is historic, US Navy ships visit Norway more often. Recently, US submarines have become more frequent in Norwegian ports. This, of course, allows the submarines to take supplies and return to their operation areas more quickly. The U.S. submarine forces said that they increased their activity in the Atlantic last month, that they were watching it very closely, and that NATO partners and allies provided them with critical support in this regard. In addition, the U.S. Navy made long efforts to increase its number after the Ukrainian war and to establish a more advanced and modern fleet than the previous ones. The launch and maiden voyage of the USS Ford is a reward for these efforts. The U.S. Navy currently has 11 aircraft carriers, and the vast majority of these ships are powered by nuclear power. But nuclear energy, as in any situation, has risks at sea. A major disadvantage of the U.S. Navy's nuclear-powered aircraft carriers is that they require mid-life refueling and a complex overhaul or co. This means refueling nuclear reactors essentially requires the ship to be taken apart, and general maintenance takes at least 4 years. The maintenance of the USS George Washington took 6 years. Complex maintenance schedules at his Newport News shipbuilding facilities have extended the time required for the procedure. Also, the effects of COVID-19 measures in 2020 have only extended the repair time further. Since August 2017, the 6th carrier of the Nimitz class and the 4th U.S. Navy aircraft carrier named after the country's first president has passed through the RCOH. In the process, its systems were modernized and the interior of the ship was renewed. Factors prolonging their COH include delays and changes in her COH planning and start timeline due to FY15 budget decisions to disable the ship. Ship's arrival status more challenging than expected, planned, and budgeted, including growth work in key areas of RCOH. Last March, it was announced that the USS George Washington would be deployed to Japan in 2025, replacing the USS Ronald Reagan. This week, however, CVN 73 began preparing for this deployment. The aircraft carrier left the shipyard earlier in the week and sailed across the James River towards the Atlantic Ocean. In the next few days, Flat Top will begin the first round of sea trials. The departure of the USS George Washington comes just days after the U.S. Navy released a comprehensive report outlining the quality of life issues for the crew assigned to the ship while the ship was at the shipyard. From August 2017 to April 2022, 9 sailors assigned to the aircraft carrier died by suicide, and an investigation is underway. So why did these sailors commit suicide? The commander of the U.S. Fleet Forces reported that the Navy neglected to explain how extending the ship's maintenance period by almost 2 years would affect the crew on board. Unlike ships and submarines under construction, which are essentially shipyard-owned until handed over to the Navy, ships that pass through the RCOH are technically still in service, and crews are deployed at the shipyard during the maintenance period. The Navy's published investigation revealed that young sailors assigned to George Washington are subject to some of the toughest living conditions in the military. Seafarers were isolated from family and peers during RCOH. In addition, they were exposed to long working hours. In addition, the Naval Air Force noted that the Navy's leadership was found to be focusing on the effects of the ship's finances and delays, rather than the effects of the extended maintenance period on the crew. In a statement on the subject, the U.S. Navy stated that they could not account for the real costs of this process on the sailors. A spokesperson for the U.S. Navy said, "We understand their situation and we can measure it, test it, improve it, and master it until it's almost predictable. This is where we are most comfortable." The next carrier planned for the midlife overhaul, the USS John C. Stennis, has been on the Newport News shipbuilding tour since May 2021. The Navy assured that it would divert resources to the welfare of the crew. So what makes the USS George Washington so special? The USS George Washington was launched in August 1986 and was formally enlisted in the Navy on July 4, 1992. Just 2 years later, then-President Bill Clinton and First Lady Hillary Clinton hosted a delegation of country leaders to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the day landings in Normandy, France. On June 5, 1994, Clinton laid the wreath in the waters of the English Channel in honor of soldiers lost at sea during the landing of Normandy. Later that year, the Nimitz-class aircraft carrier, capable of carrying up to 90 aircraft, was sent to the Persian Gulf, where it took part in Operation Vigilant Warrior to protect Kuwait from a second invasion by Iraq. Along with the amphibious assault ship USS Tripoli and 2,000 Marines from the 15th Marine Expeditionary Division, The ship's arrival convinced the guards to withdraw. In November 1994, Iraq officially recognized an independent Kuwait following the terrorist attacks on New York City and the Pentagon on September 11, 2001. The USS George Washington was deployed with the aircraft carriers USS John F. Kennedy and USS John C. Stennis to protect the United States from potential attacks. The ship was commissioned as the protector of New York City and the East Coast. The USS George Washington was later one of the several Navy ships to participate in disaster relief after the 2011 Tohoku earthquake and tsunami. Another support to the Ukrainian army came from China. Putin was furious when he heard about this. Putin made very big decisions after this betrayal. China's attitude stunned the whole world when the power of the Ukrainian army reached a different point. Russia looked for a hole to escape from in the last days of the Russian-Ukrainian war. There have been very big developments. These developments in the agenda have brought the Ukrainian army to a very different point. In response to these developments, the Russian army started to experience great difficulties. But with this betrayal, Putin took action to impose huge sanctions. With the support to the Ukrainian army, it became impossible for the Russian army to stay in the Ukrainian region anymore. Just before the war started, Russia decided to sign an agreement with China in the framework of this treaty of friendship. Everything was ready for the invasion of Russia. That's why many war analysts thought that the Russian-Ukrainian war could lead to World War III at a time when the East and West were divided into such blocks. Such a catastrophe was expected to cause trouble for the whole world. But what happened was that China started to oppose Russia's policies. These moves by China, which had been abstaining on every issue related to this invasion, surprised Putin, but no one expected this latest move. Putin's unstable policies have started to cause great distress all over the world. That's why the whole world was constantly supporting the Ukrainian soldiers, because if Putin succeeded in invading Ukraine, he would start looking for new territories. This could have been the basis for the world war that the whole world was trying to avoid. But it was Israeli intelligence that uncovered Putin's evil plan. As a result of their intensive work, Israeli intelligence stated that Russia would try to take a different step. First of all, Israeli intelligence stated that after Ukraine, the target is Moldova and the Baltics, and said that Putin must be stopped urgently. This has caused great concern in these countries as the situation became very complicated. The Ukrainian army received a lot of support, one after the other, but the most unexpected was this latest support from China. As a result of the US's continuous production in China, China is no longer a country that can act on its own. Therefore, it was not possible for China to support Russia directly, but it was also not expected to make moves against Russia. When China decided to support Ukraine, the whole world was confused. There was a huge upheaval in the Russian army because with China on the other side, Russia had no allies left. With everyone reacting against Putin for his unjust invasion attempt, the Russian army was now backed into a corner. But no one could have imagined that China would provide such great support. Since the beginning of the war, every single support given to the Ukrainian army was for itself. But with this latest support, it is now being considered that the Ukrainian army should also organize operations against Russia. The offensive-oriented tanks sent to the Ukrainian army by the West and the European Union were meant to help Ukraine end the war. But with this latest step, China has also joined the tank support to the Ukrainian army. China has announced that it will send 12 Type 59 model tanks and 23 Type 05 model armored reconnaissance vehicles. This once again showed that the whole world supports the Ukrainian army. While the Russian army could not take the slightest step in response to the support, it was shown to everyone how critical it is for Ukraine to use these tanks in its operations. The comments made by the war analysts afterwards were echoed all over the world. According to war analysts, the fact that Ukrainian troops received support even from China showed the world which side the war had turned to. The Ukrainian army was now far superior to the Russian troops. The most important reason for this was the unjust occupation of Ukraine, which received a lot of support. Therefore, more and more support was given to the Ukrainian soldiers. At this rate, the Ukrainian army will become a major regional power right after the war. This will actually create much bigger problems for Russia because it is known that Russia uses many countries in this region as satellite countries. Ukraine was the same way until recently, but after Ukraine's rebellion, other countries are expected to rebel against Russia. If so many countries rebel against Russia, its power will be completely exhausted and Russia will completely lose its dominance in this region. Therefore, even the collapse of the Russian Federation has come into question in the event that Russia's steps go this way. Different countries have taken action to intervene in the war. The interaction of these countries shocked the whole world after the countries that supported the Ukrainian army. Some countries started to prepare to fight against Russia. One of them was Poland. Poland withdrew its army to Russia's borders. After that, Poland made very threatening statements. Poland said that they would go to war against Russia if Russia entered Kiev. While this situation had a great repercussion all over the world, the Ukrainian army gained a lot of morale after these statements. The main reason for Poland's statements was that Russia wanted to invade Poland. Poland is aware of this and realizes that after the invasion of Ukraine, it will be its turn. Therefore, since the beginning of the war, it has continuously supported Ukraine. It is a matter of curiosity how much more the support can be, especially thanks to Poland's breakthroughs and Leopard-2s. The Ukrainian army has received a very serious modernization. As such, it can be said that Ukrainian soldiers are now far ahead of the Russian army. One of the main reasons for this is Russia's wrong policies at the very beginning of the war. The Russian army attempted a very serious invasion. It went very far into the Ukrainian territory. But then the defense line of the Ukrainian army started to repel the Russian soldiers. Thanks to this repulsion, Ukrainian soldiers put the Russians in a very big crisis because there was a very fast repulse. The Russian army had to leave behind a lot of ammunition and vehicles. After that, Ukrainian soldiers took these vehicles and ammunition into their own inventory and started to use them against the Russian army. This situation started to form the basis of the Russian army's problems with ammunition and weapons. Russia has started a new mobilization to replace the soldiers it lost in Ukraine. Within the scope of this mobilization, a large number of Russian youth were recruited after being recruited. These Russian youth were sent to the headquarters to undergo certain trainings. The weapons given to the Russian youth were recorded as a great disappointment. They started to give Russian youth weapons from the Soviet Union era. The reason for this was that thanks to the successful operations of the Ukrainian army, Russia was in serious trouble. These weapons, combined with the inexperience of the Russian youth, were the basis for very serious problems and very serious injuries. If the Russian army continued to experience such problems, it would lose its control over many areas in Ukraine. But if Ukraine's attacks here continue, Russia's loss of dominance in this region will continue at full speed. And this could be the basis for Russia to face very serious problems and for Putin to lose power. There is some good news. The Russians continued prioritizing their least successful direction and throwing their best forces in an attempt to capture Volodya. Despite successfully rebuffing previous Russian attacks, the Ukrainians have found a way how to destroy Russian attackers even more easily. Because today it was reported that they eliminated a Russian commander in charge of the assault units with a precision strike, which allowed them to destroy the disorganized troops on the ground much faster. Last time I told you that the Russians attempted to penetrate the front line west of Alata in order to create a bulge, stretch Ukrainian reserves and diminish the supply and support of Alata. As you remember, the Ukrainians met the attackers with fire and prevented them from establishing control over the hills. But as it turned out, the Ukrainians did not stop there. Today, Russian commander of the forces located in this region reported that the Ukrainians immediately launched a counterattack. Some sources indicate that as a result of this counterattack, the Ukrainians have pushed the Russians back to their initial positions across the river. After that, some Russian sources said that several Ukrainian groups were spotted between Prakisinka and Pavlivka. They concluded that the Ukrainians were preparing to further penetrate Russian defenses and that the Russians prudently scared them off with artillery. However, today's report about the successful Ukrainian on the Russian command post of the East Battalion strongly indicates that the Russians were not planning an attack. They were just sending reconnaissance groups into the Russian territory while the Ukrainians were conducting this reconnaissance mission. The Russians launched yet another assault in the direction of the hamlet east of Volodar, but because the Ukrainian HIMARS strike on the Russian headquarters killed the headquarters commander, the coordination of Russian forces was undermined and the Ukrainians quickly repelled the Russian attack. Another Russian commander said that it was a smart move on the part of the Ukrainians because if he destroyed the army headquarters, the battle will continue. But if he destroyed the battalion headquarters, the battle will quickly die out because battalion headquarters are most involved in the process of managing and collecting and analyzing what is happening on the ground. All other headquarters built their understanding of the current situation mainly from the battalion level reports. He added that they were ready for such developments and had prepared alternative ways. But as many speculate, this was likely added to avoid problems with the higher command. The most recent updates indicate that the Russians became quieter, which suggests that there are further attacks were either put on hold or cancelled. This is not the first commander that the Russians have lost here. Around a week ago, in one of the disastrous Russian attacks, the Russians lost a colonel who was in charge of the whole brigade. The fact that the Russians continue committing significant amounts of resources to the border area despite high losses clearly signals that taking bolder is imperative for achieving broader goals. Furthermore, recently published geolocated footage showed the aftermath of a Russian thermobaric artillery strike near Volodarka. As noted by the Institute for the Study of War, thermobaric artillery systems are military district-level assets which suggest that Russian forces put a high priority on Volodar. Thermobaric artillery is a devastating weapon, but its main shortcoming is that its range only 4 kilometers, making it an easy target. The Ukrainians are hunting down these artillery systems, so the Russians usually need them as a lost cause. The fact that the Russians are continuously engaged in them despite very effective counter-battery fire once again emphasizes the importance of Volodar in order to take advantage of the opportunity to destroy this rare Russian artillery systems. The Ukrainians have relocated to the Volodar area another artillery brigade, and now Volodar should have as much artillery support as Bakhmut. Overall, the Russians are spending their resources at a much faster rate than previously, which signals the urgent need for the success of operational significance before they can launch an attack of strategic significance. Nonetheless, the Ukrainians continue holding their main strongholds and forcing the Russians to put all their plans on hold by rebuffing their attacks. Recent developments, in particular the death of several commanders responsible for the battalions and brigades, is a much bigger setback because, firstly, they need to cancel their plans and find a replacement, and secondly, the replacements will unlikely be as experienced as previous commanders, which will undermine Russian performance even more.